I'm SP from Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D., a show about the general Marvel comic universe, part of the Gonna Geek Network, just like the show you're checking out now. Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other hilarious and fun geeky shows at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. Welcome to episode 309 of Better Podcasting. On this show, we discuss the Podcasting 2.0 movement and what it might matter to the hobby podcaster.
In this week's Better Podnerings, topics include shorts weather lasting a little longer for YouTube, convertible microphones, and might I move forward by moving backward?
And finally, in this week's Better Podback, we run down several responses we got to our social media discussion last week.
Lauren, start the show now.
This is Better Podcasting. We are hobby podcasters through and through, just like you. That's why we are different. We minimize the money talk so that you can focus on building a better podcast.
Welcome to episode 309 of Better Podcasting. I am Steven, and I am happy to say SP is here this week.
I am, and we have charged into November. It's almost the end of the year. Only a few more episodes of Better Podcasting left.
Yes, it is. Today we are recording this on November 1st, 2024, which means Halloween has come and gone, and that means that it is time for me to don the Christmas apparel.
I see. Is it Mariah Carey season yet?
It's almost Mariah Carey season, which means that it's definitely Steven decorating his house season for sure.
Okay, that just happens year round. I mean, there's no start, there's no stop. It just keeps going. It's an endless vortex.
Well, if you didn't catch what SP was just saying a minute ago, we are only a few episodes left in the season because we will be taking what is now going to be our annual leave, meaning that we will be not recording a portion of November and
some
all
would
of
say
December.
Annual incarceration.
That as well. So get your Better Podcasting fixins in now and come to our Discord at betterpodcasting.com/Discord because there's lots of awesome geeky people over there, including fellow podcasters, and you want to come chat over in the Gonna Geek Discord.
And what you want to do is send us your How I Save My Podcast stories. We are doing those again. We want to hear how you have saved what you have not been able to do right, and then you get to save it. Or maybe it just all falls apart and you have to start all over from scratch. One of the two. Either way, we would love to hear from you. And you can email us at podcast@betterpodcasting.com. The non-centralized or distributed nature of podcasting makes it incredibly difficult to try to steer the entire industry at any one time. It's because of this that changes in the way podcasts are published and distributed hasn't seen a ton of changes since it was discovered in 2004. I think that's the politically correct term now. Discovered. Podcast was discovered in 2004. Now, when Apple was a bit larger part of the podcast consumption space, it decided to make some RSS updates unilaterally, such as in 2017 at the WWDC to include seasons, episode numbers, the type of episode, and changing the podcast categories. These were great and welcome, but the podcast industry and podcasters were not consulted. There were so many other improvements podcasters wanted to make, such as other destinations even, and other destinations wanted to make their own changes to the RSS episode tags. But in the end, it didn't matter because as long as some big players in the distribution and consumption side of the things adopted what was needed, then those changes move forward as is. And the race has been on ever since to update the infrastructure of podcasting, which centers around the RSS feed tags. Of note, today is the Podcast Standards Project, who just recently met at Podcast Movement 2024 and announced work on the following tags: podcast, podroll, and podcast person. There was once high hopes for this group to advance things in the podcast space and including the RSS feeds, but It's been extremely slow and has suffered high turnover rate. Then there is the Podcasting 2.0 movement, and that's largely driven by Adam Curry and Dave Jones in a transparent, collaborative fashion that is ultimately a set of new features and standard to make podcasting better for everyone. Oh, it's also to monetize in a value for value model using a form of Bitcoin called Satoshi. So it's all monetization, right? Monetization driven. However, today we're not going to focus on cryptocurrency or value for value monetization. And we apologize if you came here for that, but we're hobbyists, not entrepreneurs, and not businessmen. So that's out of our wheelhouse to discuss on Better Podcasting. But we will take a look at the Podcasting 2.0 namespace and take note of what the changes might be beneficial for hobby podcasters. What are some wins so far with the effort and what might not be working so well with the effort, and why a good portion of this may or may not actually matter much to you as a hobby podcaster yet.
You know, when you were saying there that we're not going to focus on the money part, it's almost like we're going to minimize the money talk.
Yeah, and just talk about tips or tricks of actual podcasting for the hobby podcaster. Absolutely. So, Stephen, what is Podcasting 2.0? I have an answer, but do you want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, the answer that I would say is actually one I found on a website called podcasting2.org. And it says, quote, Podcasting 2.0 is a set of new features and standards that make podcasting better for everyone, end quote. Okay, I'll argue with that a little bit, but I digress. That clears it all up for everybody, right? That's a very, very specific, authentic, and in-depth description.
I have a question.
Okay.
What does that mean?
Yeah, exactly. What does it mean makes podcasting better? Anyways, we'll go through some of that today. So over, if you look at the podcastindex.org website, there is linked there the website of Adam Curry and Dave Jones's Podcasting 2.0 show, and there's a reference that says, well, it doesn't actually say anything either. So as we explore further, we're finding ourselves more confused trying to find information. So we're now confused. What is Podcasting 2.0? Well, there has to be more. So if you dig in a little deeper and you go over to the Podcast Index namespace, which is a critical part of Podcasting 2.0, we will at least lay that breadcrumb for you there. It says Podcasting 2.0 is a set of forward-looking ideas combined with the technology to realize them. It's a vision for what the podcast listener experience can and should be. There are 3 parts to Podcasting 2.0: the podcast namespace, web app friendliness, and value for value. There is more information that we'll get into in a second on the GitHub, but let's just highlight right now, out of a couple different Podcasting 2.0 sites that are out there, it took us crawling into the weeds of the namespace GitHub to actually find some form of real explanation of what it actually could be in some form of high-level, meaningful capacity. That is alarming.
All right. Well, let's get into those 3 parts of Podcasting 2.0 that the Podcast Index GitHub had. So the GitHub describes the namespace and 10 new features. It also describes the sections for Be Web App Friendly and Value for Value. We won't be discussing either of them today, but suffice it to say, Web App Friendly refers to your RSS feed not serving up, quote, mixed content, unquote, and that your podcast is served over HTTPS with a valid certificate. Also, the correct CORS, that's the acronym, CORS, policies must be enabled on your domain and that your podcast content is served from. Both are very techy and deserve a more in-depth explanation. However, for the purposes of our hobby podcasting 2.0 discussion today, we'll let that be our end of our coverage at this point on those 2 parts of Podcasting 2.0 and move on to the more important discussion for most hobbyists. Now, as far as the value for value, it is a way for your audience that they can support you with cryptocurrency. We do think this bears a note that this could be relevant to hobby podcasters that wish to try to monetize in this way. However, it is very complex for both the podcaster and the podcasting listener at this time. And for most hobbyists, it would start with choosing a podcast media host that supports the podcast value namespace tag in your RSS. This is why we included it in our list of 33 criteria that we used earlier this year to evaluate a podcast media host service. But there is so much more to it. And if you are interested, we would encourage you to check out the 3 websites we just referenced for more information. So aside from value for value, what are the benefits of the Podcasting 2.0 project for hobbyists?
Well, the first benefit that we're going to talk about might be the biggest one, which is that Podcasting 2.0 is how things seem to be trending for evolving the RSS tags that are in there, specifically including the namespace tags. Because if you get involved in Podcasting 2.0 discussion, you will find there is quite a bit of debate right now on what tags to implement and what those tags actually do. But there has been some success in getting some of those namespace tags adopted to date, so we will give some community credit there. Essentially, these tags are going to be things that are going to end up enhancing your RSS feed, depending on the level, of course, on which tags are implemented and on what level. We'll come back to that in a little bit. When you hear about the namespace list, you'll probably start to put together some of these benefits, or at least imply some potential benefits from the descriptions we're about to give to you. So let's go over the 10 listed namespace tag features via the Podcasting 2.0 GitHub posts that are out there. And the first one is the one that has had some of the biggest buzz right now, and it is transcripts.
It's probably the singular most successful piece of the Podcasting 2.0 movement to date. The transcripts tag means you can deliver a text transcript along with your episode to make your content more accessible to those with hearing challenges or for those learning your language. Another tag that was described was funding. This points listeners back to a donation or membership page of yours that they can click on to join or donate money to your show. Chapters is another hotly contested tag. Basically, MP3 files have had the ability to embed chapters for many years, but now you can create a chapters file that gets delivered along with your episode to allow rich content like images, embedded web pages, titles, and silent markers. This chapters file lives on the web, so it can be changed later after publishing without uploading a new audio file or changing your episode. Stephen, I think it's important to note at this point in time that none of these beyond transcripts have actually been implemented universally across the entire space. So we're talking about the Podcasting 2.0 movement wanting to enact these tags into the RSS. The next tag is sound bites. Specific short bits of your episode to serve as an intro or as a teaser for your show. Persons is the next tag. You can give multiple bios in your episode that have short about descriptions of the people on that episode, like hosts, guests, etc. Did you interview someone cool? Point to their headshot image and link to their Wikipedia page or their blog. It makes searching for people within podcasts easy and enjoyable, or so the website has stated. The next tag is location. Is your podcast about a specific place? Take its location right in the episode or podcast feed to let people know. It makes your show more discoverable on the web. At this point, Stephen, I want to take a little break, specifically with the location tag. Is this where the episode was recorded? Are you talking about a specific place? Are you trying to reference an audience in a specific location? Say, Stephen, you are a fan of a NFL team. We will leave that team nameless right now. You live in Canada. There is currently no NFL team in Canada. So if you did a podcast on that NFL team, probably be nice for you to tag the location that NFL team is either playing in or calls home base, right? That would be a way to use. So there's a lot of variability in what that location tag would be. And this goes to the point that these tags need further development before they're actually implemented. Okay, so there's more, Stephen. You ready for more?
I am.
Okay, name seasons. Seasons have been around for a while, but now you can name them. This way you can avoid the hassle of trying to cram everything into your show title. There was title stuffing or author tag stuffing a while back. So yeah, this was an attempt to get rid of that. Trailers is another tag. Trailers can exist as a separate audio video file outside of an actual episode. They can be tied to a specific season for promotional consistency. License? Want to protect your work from derivative use or other way around? You can assign a specific license to the content of the entire podcast or different licenses for each episode. You can use pre-existing open source licenses or write one yourself. And the last one we'll go in depth on is alternate enclosures. It's now possible to deliver alternative versions of your content in the same podcast feed. You can assign video versions of an audio podcast, or maybe a low or high bandwidth version of the main audio video file. Or perhaps you want to deliver a version of your content over another method like IPFS or WebTorrent. Wow, that's a lot deeper than I think most hobbyists would really want. Anyway, those are some in-depth explanations of main tags of the RSS feed that they would want to put into the namespace. But there's a list of others like locked, episode, GUID, value recipient, which is a subset of value, medium, images, live item, content link, social interact, block, TXT, which I assume is text, but I don't know what that means, remote item, pod roll, update frequency, pod ping, value, time split, chat, and publisher. These are all very techy and nerdy, but Podcasting 2.0 has been one of the biggest pushes to attempt to universally add features to your podcast since Apple's WWDC in 2017 or Spotify's editions that occurred about the same time. Both were only for their podcast directories and not a universal decision for the entire podcast space. There has been the creation of the aforementioned podcast standards project as well, but nothing has come out of it since its inception in March of 2023. So the only game in town to move the podcasting RSS backbone along in recent years has been Podcasting 2.0. Now, getting ultra nerdy for a second, we just want to acknowledge that the namespace tags that we talked about are not technically synonymous with the Podcasting 2.0 movement. But given that Podcasting 2.0 is being a key driver behind elevating these tags, and that these tags are a big part of the Podcasting 2.0 project, we are going to treat them as such for the purposes of our discussion today. Now, essentially, the Podcasting 2.0 tag's biggest takeaway for hobby podcasters is that if it takes off, it's going to allow you to expand what information is being distributed as a universal standard through your podcast's RSS feed. Stephen, why does this matter?
Well, a good example that we'd like to reference about why all of these tags and the potential of eventually implementing expanded tags as a standard is to look back at the Google Play Music podcast implementation. And you're saying to yourself, what, Google Play Music? Don't you mean Google Podcast, Stephen? No, I'm not actually talking about Google Podcasts. I'm talking about the precursor to Google Podcasts, which was podcasting on Google Play Music. Well, back when that was implemented by Google, Google tried to add various different tags to the standard that they would then read. There were a couple decent additions that they added in as unique Google Play tags to the RSS feed, but in the end, a lot of podcasts didn't end up supporting these tags because the portion that was being of people's listenership that was being downloaded through Google Play Podcasts was low compared to other places. So there wasn't a lot of pickup on these tags. So in the end, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze for different companies to develop support for these tags, for podcasters to put the effort into filling in these tags. And eventually, Google Play Podcasts mostly just was handing out, or at least was for a lot of podcasts, handing out the standard RSS tags and not the expanded ones that were potentially available through Google Play Podcasts. So this is something that happens if you don't get uptake on trying to add new tags. So if the podcasting tags are expanded through the Podcasting 2.0 movement, and there is widespread adoption, we'll come back to that, it does increase the potential reach that these tags will have, meaning that they do become worthwhile to be supported and for hobby podcasters to fill out, so that this information that we just outlined can be distributed through a supported way, through a supported tag, not just sort of ad hoc like people are putting all these information into their show descriptions now. No, there might actually be this information distributed through a proper place to put it, and thus the juice does become worth the squeeze for the hobby podcaster to fill these out. So that's why the podcasting 2.0 movement is something that we're watching, as well as the adoption of the subsequent tags. What are some cons though, SP?
Yeah, there's bad that comes with the good. First of all, it's very complex. And what do I mean by that? You have to adopt all these new tags, which right now is not universally adopted. So you got to find a podcast media host provider that supports it. And then if you want to take full advantage of, say, the value for value, you got to set it up with some sort of a wallet, and there's cryptocurrency involved and everything. And it's just not easy. There's no one button to push. You actually have to go in and set things up. There are people, especially at the podcast media host providers, that support this, that will help you. But you have to get their help in order to make sure everything is working great. Also, there is a perception out there that this is just, it's those cryptocurrency boys over there that are trying to push this because they love Bitcoin. There's probably some point to that, but there's also a point that they're making that the technology is there to support value for value in a streaming fashion, meaning you can get a Satoshi, which is like a penny on a dollar, it's Satoshi to a Bitcoin. You can get a Satoshi for a certain time period that has been streamed by somebody. So then you have to have a player that supports it as well, getting back to the complexity. As you can see, it's all very intricate and it's difficult to keep up with. And you actually have to actively keep up with it if you want to do that. Another thing is it works in the face of the advertising industry, because that is how they make money, is everybody takes a cut of the ads that are being purchased along the podcast. And if you fund via value for value through podcasting 2.0, then you subvert that ad industry. So the entire podcast space is not supportive of it because everybody else wants to be like radio and make money the old-fashioned way through advertisements. And also, there's no authoritative body to approve or disapprove this stuff. There's just companies that have services that say they're going to support it or not. So it has to be driven by community momentum, not necessarily by one authoritative body. And that's the distributed nature of podcasting to begin with, which we all love because it allows us to get our podcasts out. But the con to all this is that there's no authoritative body to say, this is what it's going to be, and you go ahead and do it. There's not even an ability to actually poll everybody and do an election and see if you want to do yay or nay on this. It's just too massive of an industry that is separated. So, yeah, as I said before, you're really at the mercy of your media host, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the potential biggest cons there, because we did an entire season dedicating to reviewing the media host from the hobby podcaster perspective. And yes, as we mentioned earlier, we did include podcasting 2.0 there as something that we were considering as more of a nice to have, and not really a feature that was going to put a lot of weight into our overall rating for that particular media host. And this is because we think in the year 2024, there are so many other features that hobby podcasters really need to consider before they really consider the podcasting 2.0 support as of right now. But as we went through anyways, it turned out that there wasn't a lot of podcasting 2.0 support throughout the different media hosts anyways, but it was something we were looking into. For us, this means that it's reasonable for us to assume that you're probably choosing your media host for other reasons outside of the podcasting 2.0 support. You have a list of things that you find are important for you. And if you choose a media host based off of those, you're really at their mercy for whether or not they are going to choose to then implement the podcasting 2.0 standard. And if so, which tags? So this is something that you really need to consider, that your media host is probably best you choose it for your own personal criteria And the podcasting 2.0 will be something that is a nice to have. And therefore, you are really just sitting back and waiting to see what they end up adopting.
Yeah, and there's an argument to be made that the movement in itself excludes a certain set of podcasters, including the hobby podcaster. To explain a little bit more in depth, let's back up to the list of features that we talked about that the podcasting 2.0 movement wants to implement. These list of features were created by people who thought they were the top needed features by the industry. But does everybody really need them? For example, funding. Sound bites and chapters. Those are three of the tags, right? Make the assumption that everyone has time to generate these things. Some podcasters may not. They just want to grip it and rip it and post it. What happens if these tags take off and you're an outlier by not having them? You may get forced out the door of the podcast space if you don't adapt to the need, but that will depend on if these tags are adopted by the listener base itself. So it's not a for sure thing. It's an if thing. It's like my concern about the podcast industry that the distribution hubs like Apple Podcasts and Spotify will close off and make you pay to get a part of it. Hasn't happened yet. There's no talk of it happening. So we don't know about the adoption of these tags either. And Stephen, you have a specific concern.
I just throw this out here in the realm of this discussion here is I take a little issue with the name podcasting 2.0, just considering sort of how it came to be. The history of the movement was just started by a couple of names in the industry. And I think there's a little implied arrogance by the name saying 2.0, this is the new evolution of podcasting. It's not like, the podcasting standards upgrade or something like that, right? Like it's a 2.0 is a very definitive thing, and I think that the name itself implies a little arrogance because somebody came up with it and just a couple of people came up with it. But that's just a little side part that I wanted to throw in here.
Yeah. So at the moment, there's really little reason for you to prioritize podcasting 2.0 in the production of your hobby podcast. But if you kind of need to look at it in the future, you need to keep your ear to the ground in case things change rapidly to where it becomes a must-have feature, which we experienced recently with transcripts. Thankfully, Apple and Spotify implemented their own versions of the transcript. So as they were adopted, there was somebody else that was putting forth the work via AI to do it. So that is win, lose, 50-50, whatever you might want to call it with the adoption of the transcription tag. It's no extra work to you if you don't want to do it. Okay, so that's closing off our cons, but there's other food for thought when we're talking about podcasting 2.0 and hobby podcasters. So does the movement behind podcasting 2.0 carry the clout to have meaningful impact? Interesting. It's all well and good for some podcasters to have a desire to better podcasting through additional tags, but the question is, does that group carry the weight to make a meaningful difference, or does change come elsewhere in modern podcasting? The names, as Stephen said before, behind podcasting 2.0 definitely carry a place of notoriety as far as the podcast history goes. But what would happen if you polled a sample set of people listening to a mainstream podcast? Would they even know who those names are? How about polling a sample set of new podcasters? Would they know? I don't think so. We experienced this years ago when we were talking about Hall of Fame, the Academy of Podcasts, whatever they call themselves these days. And we distributed a list on several different places, one of which was our podcasting, said, hey, here you go, here's it. And most of the comments that I got on our podcasting, if I remember correctly, was, who are these people? Why is Rogan not one of the names? Why are the bigger podcasters not part of this? Why are they not part of the Podcasting Hall of Fame? Well, it's because the podcast industry knew the names from when podcasting started or was discovered. Remember, that's a politically correct term, in 2004, but not necessarily 10, 15 years later, people didn't know who they were. So it's a nice note of the history of podcasting, but it's not essentially the power behind current podcasting. And in fact, I'd probably say the power behind current podcasting is the advertising industry, because they're making those billions of dollars that you hear that are flowing through the podcasting industry. It's the advertisements. So yeah, that's an issue, I guess, with this whole thing. The reality is that podcasting has changed a ton from the time that these people carried big relevance. And so their influence on the industry has diminished from it once was. There's still names that are noted by people in the industry, but not necessarily the podcast consumption crowd audience. So in the past, we've seen changes come from the Apples and Spotify's, and they would roll out new features. Is this trend going to continue, or will it fall to these types of platforms to make the movement? Or will the power shift back to the podcaster through movements like this, or as the industry continues to ebb and flow? Talking about both Podcasting 2.0 and the Podcast Standards Project and anything else that's like it.
Another consideration that you might have about everything is that there's multiple layers of the onion that's needed to fall into place for Podcasting 2.0 to have a meaningful impact. Of course, you need those standard and features to be agreed upon. You need the RSS generation, such as from your media host, to find it worthwhile for their business to spend the time needed to adopt those features. Then you need the distribution platform to actively support these features, such as Apple Podcasts. Now, technically, this might not matter as much because if the end user is getting the RSS feed, they might be able to get the tags to their podcatcher. And if that podcatcher supports it, then they might get the information. But without proper support by the distribution platform, you could find some information is stripped, or they're just maybe less noticed because the information is not passed along to the directories where these podcasts are all listed. So if there's not full support in there, it reduces the impact of these tags. And then getting back to the podcatcher, the podcast consumption app, that also needs to support these. And then, of course, lastly, arguably, potentially, the most important one, the listener needs to actually care about these features. The listener needs to be able to say, okay, I like these features. I want to see these features, because if something's not being used, it's probably not going to gain momentum. That's just how life works. And then it just ends up in a pile of things that are there that nobody uses. So there's a lot of steps that need to come together to get Podcasting 2.0 to gain meaningful long-term momentum. It definitely might happen. It might not happen either. We're in the infancy of the movement, so we'll see what ends up happening. Consider this, though, although we didn't talk about the money aspect today, in our opinion, it's pretty clear that some of the loudest voices currently behind it are doing it for the money aspect. Well, also consider this. The big money is trying to figure out how to best capitalize on podcasting. There's still that ebb and flow happening with how the money is working. This does include different areas like podcast directories, podcast apps, and media hosts. These are all people trying to get money, make money off of the podcast industry. So they have to consider, how does Podcasting 2.0 affect their bottom line?
If Podcasting 2.0 puts their bottom line in jeopardy, there could be potentially motivation for them to actively work against implementing Podcasting 2.0, or at least the parts of that could impact them. And then the standard starts to break and it becomes fractured, potentially losing its momentum. So the bottom line, it's the multiple layers of the onion. As Stephen was saying, I'll give you a relevant example. Just in the industry of the past 10 years or so, as EVs became more viable and more commonplace, the big oil companies and automobile manufacturing companies in Detroit, they started to lobby against how Tesla and others were actually doing it. Did they have to sell vehicles directly, or could they go through dealerships? How could you maintain them? Where can you actually charge them? What kind of taxes need to be thrown on vehicles? And that was a whole thing that needed to be worked through, and I think is still in some sort of fight or negotiation between the companies themselves and politicians. Same thing is happening here, if that example speaks to you. So getting back to the techie area that we started, Podcasting 2.0 is inherently of a technical nature. Think about this. The movement is basically an attempt to add more features to podcasts through additional RSS tags. But your podcast in itself is dependent on a bunch of podcast tags and features that already exist. When you think about managing your podcast, how much do you think about the technical layer under the hood? There's very few of you out there that are listening to this that actually roll your own RSS feed. So we'll recognize a bunch of our audience is inclined of this nature, yes, but think about the general podcast production public. How much are they going to be thinking about this? Or do they just fill out the fields on a web page to post their episode? As such, if you're going to spend any time thinking about podcasting 2.0, you may want to think more about the features itself rather than the dirt under the hood. Is there a feature that stands out to you? If so, take a look. Is there a way to achieve the essence of that through the existing methods while you wait to see how podcasting 2.0 shakes out? For example, some podcast apps support chapter markers simply through timestamps. Sure, it doesn't support changing an episode logo while you transition to the different chapter, but at least they are audio markers of where the chapter starts and stops because the next one starts. So that's the example there. Finally, we'd also mention that we think it's important to consider the Kool-Aid factor. Yeah, are you drinking it? Steven, you like the punch, or do you like the orange, or what do you like?
What I like to do is just open a whole bunch of packs of them and mix them all together.
Oh, the suicide.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're listening to this show, you clearly like thinking about podcasting on some level. As such, we think there's a chance you follow other industry news or listen to other industry discussion podcasts. There is a long-standing history of industry voices quickly touting potential new podcasting features as the next best thing to slice bread. Right away, you got to do it. There is also a history of some of these features fading away or losing its momentum entirely. We're still in a state of not knowing how it'll shake out for podcasting 2.0. So we'd encourage you to at least be aware of the Kool-Aid factor here. Some people have ulterior motives for trying to get you to drink the Kool-Aid. And as a hobby podcasters, those reasons might not be in line for how you do your show. We're not saying don't pay attention to it. I am, for instance, but if you find yourself eating, breathing, and living the podcasting 2.0 discussion, you may want to take it as an opportunity to step back, take a breath, and do a little podcasting self-check. As a hobby podcaster, there are already so many things that you have to worry about, and you shouldn't let something so technical in nature like podcasting 2.0 consume a bunch of that mind space. Yes, there are absolutely things that you may want to follow. And heck, depending on how strongly you feel about it, you may even have some efforts or actions you want to take to help contribute to support the effort. But you should definitely self-reflect and make sure you're not just getting caught up in that hype, and that might be out there for whatever movement, in this case, podcasting 2.0.
In summary, Podcasting 2.0 is an attempt to allow advancement in the RSS standard that hasn't been seen as a universal movement in the last 7 years. At least one of the improvements so far has been beneficial to hobby podcasters with the addition of the transcripts tag and how that has evolved into the space. But as with any movement, consider the motivation behind the changes. It might not matter, but it just might when you consider the cons as well. So keep your ears peeled, or put them down to the ground, whichever you prefer, and keep an eye out for what's going on with modernizing the RSS feed. That's the big takeaway from all of this here. You want to forget about the name Podcasting 2.0? You want to forget about the term namespace? Just remember, it's an attempt to try to modernize the RSS feed, and you might want to pay a little bit of attention to what's going on with it. It might change the way that you produce your show for better or for worse, or it might end up going the way of past attempted movements in the space and fade into oblivion. It's really too early to know for sure, so time will tell. Should we fade into oblivion into the Better Podnerings?
As long as there's something beyond the oblivion, sure.
Okay, SP, you found some interesting news here. I know you said you were super excited when you came across this news. You actually, I think, called me up at work and you said, Steven, you gotta stop what you're doing. Quit your job right now. I am so excited to talk about some new Sennheiser microphones.
Oh, yeah. The Sennheiser microphones. Yeah, the convertible microphones. I want a convertible someday. You know, I want to buy that car that I can drive around in the summer with the top down, and then in the winter I can put the top up, and then I don't have to worry about the cold ripping through my ears because I grew up in Minnesota. My ears have frostbite. So yeah, but convertible microphones don't exactly work the same way. And Sennheiser came out, and since we recorded last, I believe, they announced new portable wireless microphones that are designed to be affordable and a flexible all-in-one solution for content creators and videographers. You see these all the time. You've already seen these. You've seen the DJI versions of these. You've seen the, what's the other brand? Rode has them too. So there's little blocks and they have a microphone on top. You often see some sort of huge microphone cover or a dead cat on top of them to abbreviate the win. A lot of YouTubers use them. You've seen these. Well, this is Sennheiser's version. And I'll tell you, Stephen, for a podcast, if you're going to podcast, if podcast is your primary distribution method, an audio podcast, not talking about the video guys over on YouTube. If you want to do that, that's, another thing. I have a word on that though. But if you are going to do you need a studio microphone. All these little lavaliers or wireless portable microphones, whatever. Yeah, they'll work in a pinch, but don't produce your whole show that way. It's not, I get how everybody wants to do it. It's probably easy, connects to your phone and all that, but it's not the same. You need a good microphone.
So there's really two things that I wanted to comment about these. First, one thing that I thought was interesting was how they were marketing this, because you do have the clip-on microphones. The set that I believe they're selling, I think, comes with 2 microphones and a charging bar. And I believe it's the receiver is a charging bar. It's all in one. Well, they're marketing it as being able to actually clip the microphone onto the charging bar and use it actually as a handheld microphone. So, I could see how that might have a different appeal to people in the field. That's kind of some of the promo photos they put out there, how they're using it. But I will say that I'm not 100% sure that it looks the most comfortable to hold. It's a rectangular block. It looks like it's a little wider than your average handheld microphone, and I have a feeling that it might get a little uncomfortable.
Have you seen the videos, the commercials, the guys actually hand holding a Shure SM7B? Have you seen those?
No, I have not.
Yeah, they're actually hand holding a Shure SM7B.
Cool.
Yeah, like, okay, all right. And they're like holding it from the connection, right? They're holding it like,
oh no,
like just with their fingers or whatever. I'm like, geez. Yeah, not design. Use the thing that's designed for the application at hand. I will also say that I've seen some YouTube videos that are groups kind of like what I do on Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. They watch an episode and they comment on it, and they do it in a panel. They're all sitting there at a table or a desk or whatever. And some of them have pretty good microphones. Most of them, however, are echoey as crap. I'm like, oh, I'm glad this is on YouTube, because if I was listening to this in my earbuds, it would drive me nuts. Or if I was listening to it in the car, it would drive me nuts. So there is a difference. I want to point this out. There is a difference between doing a YouTube video that is a podcast. I'm not going to deny it's not called a podcast. There is a difference between that being your primary distribution method and an actual audio podcast being your primary distribution method.
The other part that I want to throw out here is that, quite frankly, I'm not going to even try to predict how things will be received anymore in the podcasting and content creation space. I don't, quite frankly, understand, well, not all things, but for stuff like this, it's hard for me to make any predictions. I don't get it. The whole lavalier thing you alluded to a minute ago, people making videos with a little lav mic, either holding it in front of them or taking their earbuds and holding them in front of them or shoving it on a pencil. I don't get it. I've had arguments with people online about this. They're like, well, look how much ingenuity they're using on that. Like, I go, yeah, but how much did they spend on that? And they could have just got the proper handheld microphone. So I don't get it. I don't understand it. So clearly I'm an old fuddy-duddy now that can't predict how trends will pick up. And maybe this has a huge fit for a niche somewhere that I just don't see.
I think it's the way because most people that are using this are using it in conjunction with their mobile device. So they create the content right there. And because of that, the traditional microphones don't really work. Again, an audio version of the output is not their primary distribution matter. It's an Instagram reel. It's a YouTube short. It's a TikTok. It is a full YouTube video. It is not an audio podcast, right? And that's okay. It's okay. We've said this all along. It's okay. If that's what you want to do, it's okay. If you want to call your video show a podcast, that's okay, because that's what the public is doing. But for our purposes of better podcasting, we're going to continue to prioritize the audio podcast as the higher form in our prioritization, not necessarily higher form overall. But because of that, an actual studio microphone is your best bet. I will say, for a guest, like if you connect to somebody over StreamYard, Riverside, if you do the VDO Ninja like we do on our shows now, and I can say that because I do it on Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Nerdy's Attic now. If you can connect to their web browser of a guest and they have one of these, it'll be a lot better sound than just going through the actual mobile device itself. So there is that. However, I still worry about the echo coming back, because you'd have to have headphones in too. And I don't know how the two interact.
I guess we'll see. And maybe in the future, you and I will be eating crow podcasting exclusively from these. No. You had a piece of information on YouTube Shorts, but before you actually run that down, little tease, I wanted to update about a change that I am exploring making. Now, we're talking about the audio versus video, and so I would like you to appeal to our audio listeners right now, SP, and tell them what you observe over my left shoulder right now.
Your left shoulder. I'm observing a Zoom. Is that the L12?
It is the L12, yes. So
okay.
I have the Zoom L12 dug back out. I dug it out this week, and here's the reason why. I have recapped how I'm having Rodecaster Pro 1 problems recently, and they seem to be increasing. This is something that we've had a couple recording sessions that have been a little wacky because of them. And just this past week, I was working at home, streaming some music, and all of a sudden, I hear this high-pitched noise start coming out of my Rodecaster Pro 1, and I had to shut the thing off, turn it back on to actually get it to function. Now, I'm not saying that it's definitely degrading. It could just be, was there a USB issue? I don't know. But in any case, there has been an increase in problems that I've been experiencing with the Rodecaster Pro 1. And usually I would say to myself, Steven, I think it's time for you to continue to be lazy selling gear and hope someone buys something randomly and try to buy yourself a new replacement. But there's nothing on the market I'm interested in right now. I'm really not. The only thing I was interested in ended up being not supported well and a wide open security vulnerability. So I at the moment am not finding anything that I'm interested in to replace the Rodecaster Pro 1. So I'm in this period of going, I think it's time that you try to tide yourself over. What is going to be the best experience to do that? And it might just be continuing to put up with the issues that are randomly coming up with the Rodecaster Pro 1. That might be the solution. But I wanted to explore the idea of the Zoom L12, reusing it, getting that back and going again. And the reason why I stopped using the Zoom L12 was a couple of reasons. Number one, obviously, the Rodecaster Pro 1 is a lot more powerful piece of equipment, but the big thing that I found annoying was if I hit the mute button on the Zoom L12, it doesn't actually mute it for the recording itself, like what's actually on the track for recording. The recording on the track is pre-mute. And I believe that's the same with the audio interface mode. So if you're bringing it into the computer, I think that's also the same thing. The mute is really for the live sound. But there's been changes. Number one, I have the OBS multi-track, which has proven that on my local recording, the local recording on the OBS track is basically as good, assuming that I got the levels dialed in, it is as good as on the recorder, more or less. It's close. There's probably a negligible difference technically, but it's pretty good, and it's an isolated track for me. But secondly, on the heels of what we just were talking about the last couple weeks, the chapter markers, the way that I can timestamp that easily, I was thinking to myself, maybe instead what I do is I bring the audio in and I essentially use the Stream Deck as my mute. So I would push a button on my Stream Deck to mute the audio track for myself into OBS, which in turn would actually take care of the mute on the OBS multi-track should I choose to use that, as well as mute me to the external. But I could also tie it to stamp the thing saying Steven muted or mute edit or whatever. So if I ever had to pull the actual raw track from the L12, I would have indicators very clearly of where I just need to go splice myself up to remove those sections that I was supposed to be muted. So I'm experimenting. I'm not sure I'm going to go this way, but the Rodecaster Pro 1 problems that I've been encountering have been so much so that I just decided, you know what? The L12 is the next best thing that I might be able to use. The Mixcast 4 had some problems with the way that the audio was coming in, some hard locks and things like that. And I believe that is ASIO driver related. And the L12 apparently has been okay with the ASIO drivers. So I'm thinking maybe I give that a shot. And I do want to say just my initial experimenting right now, all I've done is hooked up just an SM58 just to do a little bit of experimenting with it. And I will say that just playing a little bit with the ASIO drivers for the L12, which is not something I really had done before, it's very clear to me how much better it is supported with the ASIO drivers than the Rodecaster Pro 1. And I forget who it was. One of our listeners has constantly commented that they wished that the Rodecaster Pro 1 had improved ASIO drivers for the Rodecaster Pro 1. I totally understand now why they were saying that. It's an apples to orange comparison on how ASIO is ASIO is handled between the Rodecaster Pro 1 and the L12. So a little experimenting happening with me. We'll see what ends up happening. Maybe faithful L12 will call me home.
I'm pretty sure, I don't know for certain, but I'm pretty sure it was Jason or Alirun on the Discord server. He runs Smoking and Drinking in Space. I'm pretty sure he was the one who was talking about the ASIO drivers, but I could be mistaken as well. And for those of you out there that are interested in the gear parts of our podcast, we often say, make sure you budget for gear refresh every 3 to 7 years, or 5 to 7 years, right? Is generally the talk about gear. And the Rodecaster original, the Rodecaster Pro OG, or 1, as you might want to call it, first debuted in November of 2018. And that's when your Rodecaster was purchased. So you've had it now for about 6 years, give or take a little bit. So that's in that window of what we have always recommended, that it would be time to refresh your gear. So just keep that in mind for budgeting. If you buy a Rodecaster Pro 2 now, or a Rodecaster Video, or a Rodecaster Duo, think, hey, great, I'm set for a very long time. Maybe. But from our standpoint, we would want to refresh every 5 to 7 years, probably completely in your studio. I think your main computer, I think you should be thinking at least about a refresh every 3 years or so. That's extreme, but when it comes to podcasting, especially if you're doing video and streaming, you're going to need relatively new equipment. So that's just an aside with this Rodecaster Pro 1 issues that you're having, Steven. Now, that said, I can't remember when that Zoom L12 was purchased. I know you haven't used it as your prime for a long time, but it hasn't been... It's probably been longer than that by a couple of years. You probably had that longer, right?
Yeah, and I'm not so concerned about the wear just because, yeah, it sat for a long time, because for a while I was using the L8. But I will say that the faders itself they do feel like they're a little old. They probably, I don't know if you grease them or what. I don't know. I don't even know.
On the L12 or the Rodecaster?
Sorry, on the L12. Like,
okay.
They're noticeably less smooth than I remembered them. Maybe that's a me thing. Maybe I'm not remembering them right after using the Rodecaster Pro 1, which has pretty smooth faders, but they definitely feel a little rougher. So...
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you got that in the fall of 2017. So you've had that for 2 years longer, making it more of a 7-year issue now versus the 5-year. But in either case, we've both been wanting a next generation of mixer recorder. And because neither of us feel 1,000% sure about anything on the market right now. I've had issues with my Rodecaster Pro 2. You've had issues with your Rodecaster. You tried the DLZ Creator. What was the small one? DLZ
XS.
Creator XS, and had the vulnerability issue surface. Plus, DLZ was purchased by Mackie, so you're not sure about the long-term support. So yeah, there's nothing out there right now where you can say, yeah, let's go for it. Even the L12 that you're using right now, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles that those mixer recorders, like the Mixcast that you also have, has. So
oh,
yeah,
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was the second part that I didn't mention is, of course, if I do this, I will end up having to find the right plugin chain to basically do all of the processing post effects. Like, I could do a little bit through OBS for the live to make it sound a little bit better and you know, whatnot. But in the end, my workflow would slightly change, that I would just do all of the processing in post production, as opposed to doing some on the board like I could do with the Rodecaster Pro 1 now.
Okay. Well, also, we're going to move on to the next news point, which is YouTube Shorts. I don't think we've mentioned it before. It's been out there for about a month, where YouTube said we're going to expand the YouTube Shorts for 1 minute to 3 minutes, which personally I think is probably a good idea, but I'm concerned about the longevity long term with the Shorts being 3 minutes, because I think they're going to run into the same monetization issues as they ran into the Shorts at 1 minute, where YouTube creators are very hesitant to throw YouTube Shorts out there, because although they garner audience, they don't get paid for them nearly as much as an actual YouTube video. So, but 3 minutes is better than 1 minute from a marketing perspective or promotional perspective. I remember getting some Shorts out of some Artie's Attic episodes in the past year, and they were just like a minute 1 second or a minute 10 seconds. So for those of you out there like, oh, you can shorten them up, yeah, those were the shortened up versions. Like, I needed the entire 61 to 65 seconds, and I couldn't put them on YouTube Shorts. So I'm like, okay, fine. Now I can go back and redo all those on the Artie's Attic YouTube channel. I can actually put all those shorts out there, because every single short that I've done, or promotable or shareable as I call it, is under 3 minutes for sure. So I could take advantage of that. But for the most part, Stephen, I think, more is better, but I still worry about the retention rate on your listeners as well as monetization. So it's not a panacea. There are still concerns.
This is good to see, because I've been observing on TikTok, at least, a bit of a trend, and I don't know, this might be one of those trends you have to wait and see. There is a new way people are, or at least it seems new to me, people are putting their videos out. Basically, you're seeing the hook twice. They're starting with the hook out of context. Instantly, bam, the hook is there. And then it goes to the clip, and then you see the hook in the actual clip. So if I could see that potentially going, because we've talked about how, or continuing on, because we've talked about how people are just wanting content. They're wanting information short and fast now compared to years ago, and people's attention spans are lower. And that plays right into that, is like, stop the scroll, right? That, because people's attention is bad. And so if that trend does continue on, you need to have a little more time to incorporate that quick hook. Like, there's no lead into the hook. The hook is the start. And so you have to be able to have a little longer video for that. So I don't know if that's the exact reason why they're expanding it, but I'm just saying, if that trend continues, you need that additional time.
Yeah, I realize how they're doing it, and I'm just too old. I'm not. I don't know if I'd be able to start a show today, because it's just not how I like to listen. So I produce my shows how I like to listen to the shows, and that's not necessarily how I like to listen to it. I like a funny cold opening, or a cold opening that tells me what's going on. The hook, as you say, but it's not like the mega hook. It's not like the Instagram or influencer, this is the 10 things you got to know, and it's like shocking and everything. It's like, well, everything's shocking. It's like cable news. Everything's, breaking news. No, not everything's breaking news. Get rid of it. So for an older guy, it's just not for me. But I recognize that there's a whole section of the population that is way younger than me and wants to consume their content differently. So Yeah, I'll bend for that. Just not for me. Too old.
Hey, breaking news! We got Better Podback!
This is where we here at Better Podcasting turn the show over to you as we run through some of your feedback. We call this segment Better Podback.
Well, we had some ongoings in our Discord server, mostly in the Better Podcasting channel that we'll talk about here. And the first one is from Waffles. Full disclosure, he's a co-host of mine over on Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. And he came out and said, won't say it straight out, but I will. Our podcasts is garbage. Like, oh, okay. What's going on here? He said, I'm not getting, I get not letting me recommend my own show, but I can't recommend anything on Gonna Geek. I can't recommend anything where a host of that show has been a guest on mine. I'm assuming that I couldn't recommend anything that I've been a guest on. I could even understand if they wouldn't let me start my own thread, but they popped me for replies where my recommendation was perfectly in line for what the OP was asking for. Yeah, Stephen, this is a little gripe of mine from the r/podcasting subreddit, which is separate from the r podcasts subreddit. The r podcast subreddit, they've got millions of users in there, and it's mostly for listeners. But the mods of that subreddit have made it impossible for anybody who's actually a podcaster to recommend a show that is, as Waffles was pointing out, very relevant to the discussion. And I have actually stopped going in there. I can't go in there anymore because I feel like I'm muzzled and muted for no reason whatsoever. I'm trying to be respectful for how they want to run things. I get it. They don't want actual podcasting talk in there. But if you're not letting me recommend my show that is being talked about, like the subject matter is being talked about, then you're not being fair to podcasters as podcast listeners, because we're the biggest group out there that is actually listening to podcasts. It's actually podcasters, right? So, yeah. And DC Dave goes on, he said, yet another reason why I don't want to talk about the cesspool that is Reddit. You know, a lot of people think Reddit in its whole is cesspool. We tried not to make our podcasting a cesspool. And Yakko said, isn't r/podcasting supposed to be for creators? It's been a while since I've been in there. And Damien, who is also a mod over on our podcasting, said podcasts versus podcasting. SP and I are both mods on the podcasting subreddit. We try to keep it creator focused without being a promo dump outside of the sticky threads. DC Dave replied with, I walk back a little of my comment from earlier. At least part of it isn't a cesspool. Thank you.
Now, one of the reasons I wanted to throw this in here to discuss this whole thread about it is because it's on the heels of the social media talk, right? The social media we talked last week, we talked a bit about Reddit, and I thought this was a great example on how, depending on the platform you're in, you might have people who have an opinion about it based off of past experiences that they have had with that platform. In this case, DC Dave has probably seen a lot of the truth that is Reddit, that it is a cesspool. There is a lot of stuff in Reddit there, but there's carve out. Like, you know, there's carve outs here and there for things that might be up your alley. That could be like your other social media platform you choose. Maybe there is a certain type of post out there, or it leans a certain way that has made the general public think these are the type of posts that I'm going to see on there. And if your podcast doesn't fit in there, it might be hard for you to get some traction. So I just thought it was a great conversation back and forth that kind of reflected what we talked about last week about the audience that is on social media platforms can vary and can have a different impression made to people in general. So I liked it.
Yeah, moving on, since we're talking about social media, let's talk about TikTok. And Damien said, by the way, Stephen, for personal purposes, changing a TikTok link to VX TikTok makes it easier to share. Adds things like preview viewing in apps like Discord, and I believe obfuscates. Wow, I am not going to try to say that word again. The built-in tracking TikTok does.
I had not heard about this, but this was on the heels of us talking about the problems that come with trying to share TikTok videos off of the platform. This is something that I might have to take a look at, but I guess you got to manually change it, which is, I guess, a simple fix. But I don't know. It's something that I'm not familiar with. So thank you very much, Damien, for enlightening me about that.
Another thing that we were talking about was separate social media accounts. We talked about all of this before, by the way, but it was great having the conversation in the Discord. Damien said, I gave up using a separate account for me and the show when I decided to move to Threads as my main social media. It allows me to talk to other users on the platform as just myself, the person. And when we do stuff for the show, I just share parts of one of the multiple hobbies that Damien, the DM, shares on social media. And Original Waffles came back and he said, I gave up when I realized that they were basically the same thing, but that's also the joys of being the only regular on the show.
And the last piece of feedback we wanted to mention is on the heels of another comment that Waffles posted. And why we wanted to call it out here is because you, listener or viewer, have the opportunity to name Waffles' baby. And by baby, I mean his new computer. Because Waffles says, opening this up to the Better Podcasting community, what should I name my new computer? Come on over to the Discord at betterpodcasting.com/Discord and make your suggestion there. My suggestion was Waffle Stack. That was my suggestion.
That's a good one. That's a good one. All my computers and network names are sci-fi ship based.
Nice.
In my house. So that is my line. But since Waffles really enjoys Spider-Gwen, I would recommend that the audience start recommending Spider-Gwen sort of stuff to him. But I do like the Waffle Stack.
Go over to betterpodcasting.com/Discord and let Waffles know your suggestion. I'm sure there will be some creativity there to be had.
Indeed.
That's going to take us to the end of this show. Before we wrap up, I will remind you we are a part of the Gonna Geek Network. There's a bunch of amazing geeky podcasts over there. You should check that out at gonnageek.com. And the Discord is full of amazing geeky people. Check that out as well. And if you are counting down the time until we are on our season hiatus, well, that hurts our feelings a little bit, but that's okay. Just be aware that we're closing in on the end of the season. So get your comments in now so that we can make sure that we mention them with some relevance as opposed to waiting like nearly 2 months before we comment about them again.
Yeah, and I'm going to throw this out. I'm going to need some help on the next episode because the next episode topic here on Better Podcasting is all about podcasting websites. And we all know that I prefer to not have one. And Steven is the expert there. So if you want to hear from me, you need to give me some inputs on what you think is important on podcast websites.
So for episode 309 of Better Podcasting, I'm Steven saying, recording this on a Friday morning. Not sure we've ever done that before.
And MSP saying it's Friday afternoon here. Time zones. Y'all have a great week. Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for checking out another episode of Better Podcasting. You can find the full back catalog of Better Podcasting at betterpodcasting.com. If you're into geeky podcasts, please check out the other podcasts on the Gonna Geek Network at gonnageeknetwork.com. This show was produced and edited by Stephen Jondrew. Voice work was done by L.W. Salinas. Thanks again for listening or watching, and we hope to see you again next week.